Okay, we conclude chapter 1, having understood that there are 5 different levels to righteous people, to Rishoyim, wicked. Wicked doesn't mean horrific individual. And we're going to actually get a clearer understanding what that means shortly, or a little bit more. And a Beinoni, the intermediate. And the intermediate is not half and half good, half bad. Because as Rabbi says that he is a Beinoni, he was the leader of the generation. He couldn't be, half good stuff and half bad stuff. Right? So he didn't even have the sin of wasting time. But yet he called himself a Beinoni. So Beinoni means someone who doesn't even have actual sin. Again, we'll learn more about that, but that's the conclusion. Continues, the Alter Rebbe and says, well, don't we see that, like in Maimonides, and we see in the Talmud, we see the Rambam, that there's a concept of a Beinoni who is balanced, right, between virtues and non-virtues, right? And someone who has a majority of virtues versus 51 versus 49 is called righteous. I mean, that's definitely a term that's used. Says the Alter Rebbe, that's called a borrowed term. It's a figurative term in regards to reward and punishment. Because a person, when it comes to reward and punishment, is judged by the majority of their deeds. So if the majority of your deeds are righteous, well, then you are judged as righteous. That's the verdict, right? You are, in other words, acquitted in the trial. In a legal sense, the term righteous means more good than evil, right? So, but that's not the true term. The true term, when we're speaking about it as a quality of a person, not in judgment. The judgment is not a true term, right? Although we live in a world full of judgment, we make judgments all the time. So in that sense, there is a concept of judging based on, majority of what the person, their actions are. But that's not a true definition. A true definition of the righteous and the Beinoni is that the righteous, they're judged, motivated solely by their good nature, meaning their godly nature. As King David said in Psalms and Tehillim, my heart is slain within me. Meaning King David said that he was devoid, slain. Well, he slew the evil inclination in his heart through fasting. So he rid himself of the evil nature, transformed it. That's what it means. That's the concept of the righteous, which we'll get more into in chapter 10. But whoever has not attained this degree of ridding themselves or transforming their evil nature, even though their virtues outnumber their negativity, their sins, they are not on the level of the righteous. In judgment, yes, but not in the quality of personhood. They're not. And therefore, this is why our sages say that the Almighty God saw, that the righteous would be few. Because think of it. The righteous are not few when it comes to judgment about, do we do more good than bad in our lives? I hope so. I would imagine so. I mean, even that, though, needs some kind of explanation, which we'll get to later, not right now. But, so, they're not a few righteous people, according to the law of judgment. If we were to judge 50 plus 1 in good deeds, right? So, yet our sages say that God saw that the righteous were very few, and therefore he arose and planted them in every generation. There's only a few that are righteous. obviously then it doesn't mean in the quality of personhood that it's, 50 plus 1. Obviously, it means someone who got rid of their evil inclination entirely. And as we know that the tzaddik is the foundation of the world, as King Solomon writes in Mishnah Ecclesiastics. So therefore, that's why there's just a few of them. They're foundational individuals who have gotten rid of any negativity within inside of them. They don't even have a lust in their heart. So we need to revamp our understanding on all of this. So so the explanation is as follows. As explained in the Eitz Chaim. Now, I just want to remind everybody that the Alter Rebbe is writing this for specifically his Hasidim, as he wrote in the compiler's foreword, for those who were followers and that he knows personally and individually. And I suggest those who are followers of his today and of the Rebbe, so it's the same thing, because the same issues that they had, we have when it comes to the service of God, and therefore knows what our challenges, our difficulties, our pain points that are within us, and to address them, right? But he specifically wrote this book for those followers, Hasidim, and therefore specifically for the Jewish people. But the message is not only for the Jewish people, right? So even though sometimes it'll be only in that reference, but I'll try to expand upon it beyond when necessary. But the message is important. So, therefore, again, speaking to every Jew, that whether they're wicked or righteous, they have two souls. One that originates in klipa and sitra acher, klipa being a shell that covers over, sitra acher means the other side. They both bring out the same idea, non-holy, right? Coming from God. Everything comes from God, but the question is if it's holy or not. So this is a non-holy one. It is, it sort of dwells, figuratively speaking, in the blood, because the blood gives life to the body, right? And from it stems all the negative character traits deriving from what we call the four elements of, four evil elements. And the four evil elements are fire, air, water, and earth. Now, why would that be evil? Well, it's evil. Because I just want to remind you that evil translated here in Tanya means something that covers on the divine. Well, when you look at the earth, you don't see the divine. When you look at air, you look at fire, you look at water, you don't see the divine. You may contemplate upon it and then come to recognize it as the divine, but not naturally is it divine. As opposed to when you're studying Torah, naturally it's divine, right? A godly soul, naturally divine. We get that, right? So here it's evil only in the sense that it covers over, and of course it doesn't. It just means that it's a shell, a klipa, right? And the four elements of of the physical world, again, of fire, air, water, and earth, are klipa. They're just klipa, right? So now what comes from fire, the element of fire? So now he's taking these four elements and bringing them as a metaphor for us to understand the element of fire. What does fire do? It rises up. So what does that represent in my animal soul, right? What does it represent in that soul that comes from klipa, that is covering up on the presence of God? So fire, of course, anger, pride, which rises up. Right, when you get angry, full of yourself. Pride, you rise up. Well, that's what fire does. That's the metaphor of fire here in the negative sense. We're going to have the metaphor of fire in chapter 19 that's positive. Because in everything in Klippa, there's a positive element to it, right? But here's the negative element, right? The one feels superior to another. That is coming, that you feel superior to another. Even though we're talking about a Jew over here and we're going to learn about the second soul and so on, no. Then there's water. What's the metaphor of water, of the soul? Well, water gives growth to all things of life, right? All kind of pleasurable things. So water is the, when you're thirsty and you have that cup of, which I am, you have that cup of water. Ah, what a pleasure, right? So that is the seeking of the animal soul for pleasure as an end in itself, right? That's klipa. That's covering over that pleasure is not an end in itself, right? It's a tool for something greater to serve. But again, we're just giving here an understanding of a brief understanding of this soul that comes from klipa. And then we have air. Air lacks substance. Well, that's frivolity, scoffing, boasting, idle talk. They come from the element of air. And then we have earth. Earth is weighted. When you're lazy, slothful, saddened, melancholy, right? That all comes from the element of earth. That's all these things are the opposite of a holy quality, right? So this soul stemming from this. So in the Jewish soul, even though it is coming from klipa, but this klipa is called klipas noiga, that has some good in it. And therefore, there's a natural compassion and benevolence that the Jewish soul has. Because it comes from klipas noiga, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. As opposed to, which means being compassionate and giving, not for self-fulfillment, not for enhancing self, but, for the good of the other. For the good of the other, right? Concludes Today Chapter 1, it says that's not the case of the souls of the nations of the world, that as a general rule, and actually as the Rebbe explains when we come to Mashiach, it's even more so now than ever, that but as a general rule, that it is self-fulfilling as opposed to God-fulfilling, even from the animal soul. So, but as I said, now as we come closer to Mashiach, and I would suggest that you that are joining us here that are not Jewish would also be of that quality, of not for self-fulfillment, but for a higher purpose beyond self. Which, by the way, when you think about it, what does a person want in life? Self-fulfillment, feeling self. Now that could be with wonderful good things, but it's for yourself, the feel good, rather than the be good. That, and I'm talking about now purely from the animal soul. So the Jewish animal soul has that quality. I bring this always as an example of and that this is instinctive of the animal soul as opposed to adopting and living with your godly soul. Right? I want to make sure we're very clear about that. We're talking here about the animal soul, not the divine soul. We're going to speak about that in a moment. Okay? We're going to speak about that in a moment. So, I bring this as an example of the sort of natural distinction that is I live here in Montreal, and the giving that is so instinctual in the Jewish soul, right? Giving charity, that is so instinctual. It's not merely because it's taught, but it's part of the makeup of the soul. So, we have a community of 85,000 Jews versus 3.5 million non-Jews. And the amounts of monies that are collected just for the, federation versus the federation that is of the Montreal community, they collect the same amount of money, about $50 million. And that's besides Chabad, and that's besides all the Israeli institutions and so on and so forth. My point that I'm making is that there's something instinctual about even the animal soul that is far greater giving and compassionate. Now that doesn't mean there isn't corruption about that. Total. Of course, one can corrupt. I'm just giving it as I'm generalizing. And that's what the Alter Rebbe is generalizing over here. And as the Rebbe explains, as we come close to Mashiach, that the teachings of Torah and the truth of Torah and Chassidus and the Alter Rebbe's teachings inspire the world, as is happening now. More is it revealing that there's that quality in non-Jewish people there's also a quality of the klipas noiga, and that they can give because of the good that's there. But what I mean by the good for goodness sake, not good like corporate giving is good to look good, right? Jewish giving is good to be good. Or corporate or personal giving is to feel good. That's not Jewish giving. And I suggest most of the world does that. Most of the people give to feel good, not to be good. Because that feeling good is self-fulfilling. And that's why you do good. And I suggest most of you, when you came here, you were that way until you learned Chassidus. And I'm sorry if I'm harsh about that. I don't mean to be harsh. I just mean to be honest and straightforward. That I think that's human nature. So I'm not taking away something from anybody, adding something. And we can have a part of that today, if we so choose to. We can have a part of that today. And that's the end of chapter 1. Very powerful.